So friends, this fall, we chose this journey through chunk of change, listening together for how our God is a God who meets us in our everyday lives, including meeting us in the midst of the changes that we face and the threshold times that we're invited to step across, as the video reminds us, and also to see that our God also invites us to repent, to change. Mind, heart, soul change. You may have gotten that little S hook as you came in. That's just that touchstone for us, that reminder that we are always listening for those hooks in these times that we share, but throughout our lives. So if you did get one of those, hang on to that as we go through this. And I do want to say that choice, this journey through change this fall, it's no coincidence, given the historic moment that we find ourselves perched on today together. For you see, in 2 days, it not only is Halloween, chance to wear those costumes, fidget spinner, I'm excited about that one. I want to see pictures. Tuesday will mark the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation. And if those words mean nothing to you, that is absolutely okay. But we do want to spend some time saying a little bit about that. So Martin Luther, he was 33 years old, an energetic 33-year-old, an Augustinian friar and professor. He hammered his 95 Theses to the doors of Castle Church in Wittenberg in Saxony, Germany on October 31st, 1517, 500 years ago. Portrayed here, there's lots of pictures of Martin the friar. I also appreciate this picture as well. Oh yeah. Hammer time indeed. For those of you born after 19... this is a reference to the 90s, just a little, okay. So the 95 Theses, so these were Martin's lists of grievances with the church, the beginning of what he hoped would be a dialogue, a conversation to reform corrupt practices within the church, so that the church might actually become more reflective of this Christ that they claim to follow. But eventually, Luther's actions ended up splitting the 1,000-year-old Roman Catholic Church into two churches, one that was loyal to the Pope in Rome, the other protesting against the Pope's rule, and soon, in fact, calling themselves Protestant, those who protest. The Protestant church continued to split as many branches of what we experience as denominations today took their root through the years that followed. So Salt House, we are rooted in Lutheran theology, specifically the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. That's who we are associated with, which simply means that we see and we follow the life of Jesus in a way that is flavored by this lens that Luther and the other reformers gave us. There's a fabulous article this week in The New Yorker called How Martin Luther Changed the World, about Martin Luther and the historical impact he had, the life that he had, which I highly recommend. It's fabulous. It paints a very honest, rugged picture of who he was and the historical impact, not only for those years when he was alive, but through Nazi Germany and just some really incredible things that are hard in a lot of ways, but also really beautiful. So some really great things to wrestle through. We shared it on Salt House's Facebook page. If you want to find it, that's a great way to look for it. But I commend it to you, and I mention it also because I don't want to spend today talking about Martin Luther, because although it's worth naming, it's worth knowing more about him, his life, his work, what he did. There's also portions of his theology that frankly are atrocious. Like any human being, he was not like this perfect specimen of holiness. He wasn't Jesus. So to be clear, as Lutherans, it's not a rubber stamp for the person and every word of Martin Luther. So just want to be clear about that. But at the same time, there are some really amazing things that he wrote into this world and spoke into this world that have had huge impact. And we want to name this as that historic moment and pause today to name that we, as we think about that, we are people of story. This summer we spent a whole journey talking about how Jesus came to teach us to love story, our own stories, the stories of others, and that we live in a large narrative of the story of God, which is a story that we read in Scripture. It's a story that carried through the Protestant Reformation, and it continues on the pages of our lives and our world today. And so Luther nailing those 95 Theses, stop, hammer time. That is part of our story too. And so it's good for us to be curious about it as part of our story. And to be additionally clear, you don't have to identify as Lutheran to be here at Salt House, which I think you already know that. Yet there are many of us here who don't know a lot about what that means and wonder about it. So in light of this being this historic week that literally changed the trajectory of the Western church through history, that is also a part of the water that we swim in here together as we gather, it seems appropriate to explore what it means to be Lutheran here and now on this particular corner of Kirkland, Washington. And so today, I wrestled, with where to go with all of this, knowing that we can't just be here for 5 hours talking about Lutheran, Reformation history and theology. Let's just get down to it. Sorry, we're not going to stay for 5 hours for that. You're welcome. Just the piece, I just want to talk about just one piece of Lutheran theology. There'll be other times, as I was working through, it's we can really weave this in during Advent. There are just pieces that will continue to come up in the months to come that I feel really aware of. But there's just one piece that I want us to explore together. Honestly, it's what keeps me coming back to Lutheran, the Lutheran lens of the Christian faith. When I was in college, I tried the full spectrum of Christian worship and life. I went to Roman Catholic Church for a while. I went to very charismatic evangelical worship for a while, and kind of everything in between. And I want to share with you the piece that keeps me coming back to Lutheran. So, does that sound good? Cool. So to get there, a question, if you kind of check in with yourself, kind of orient us, and this is the question. When in your life have you lived through a hard time? When in your life have you lived through a hard time? Maybe it's right now. Probably more than once, right? I think of those in our community here, those facing infertility, those living through breakups and divorce, those who are staring down emergency surgery, those in broken or challenging relationships, those living through job transitions, those facing difficult decisions, those with parenting challenges, those with the private pain of addiction, abuse, depression, those facing shame after causing pain in the lives of others. There's so many ways in which people are facing hard times that I know of in our community. Also, just to consider what we see in our larger world, too, the headlines, how Puerto Rico still is largely without power, how war and fighting in the Middle East and throughout Africa, that's just the norm. That's just where people are existing every day. The rights of our LGBTQ and refugee neighbors in this country their rights continue to be threatened and even abolished. So there's hard times on many different levels that we're facing. So the question I just ask you really to specifically answer is, when have you suffered? When has it been a hard time? And I invite you just to have an actual answer, to pick something in that, and to hold on to that as we go through this time. That experience. Hold on to that as we go through this, okay? So hang on to that very intentionally. So hold on to it as we jump back to 1517. So Martin Luther, the 95 Theses, the document itself, again, it just simply proposed the framework for a university debate. Luther was arguing for a revision of the practice of selling indulgences. So this is a great Reformation historical word for you to know if you don't already know it. Do you know what are indulgences? Can you tell me a little bit about that? Yeah?
You could pay to have your sins forgiven.
Yeah, pay to have your sins forgiven. Anything else to add to that? Nuance that?
Pay to get your relatives out of
You could pay to get your relatives out of purgatory. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Shorten your time in purgatory. Yes, this is all, yes. So indulgences were kind of like a get out of jail free card. You could pay money to the church, and so when someone purchased an indulgence from the church, they obtained that for themselves or a loved one, exactly, it shortened their time in purgatory. Purgatory being that place that you go in between, you die, then you go to purgatory, and there you have to work off your sins before you're admitted to heaven. Not in the Bible, by the way, and that's not what we believe, just to be clear about that. But from Dante's Inferno, there's places where we see this in literature. But you would do that. You'd give the money, and then you get this piece of paper saying, okay, good, yeah, you're forgiven X amount of time in purgatory. Well done. 3 easy installments of $99.99, and you're good. It's just sketchy. And the more time off you got, the more it costs. And so again, in his 95 Theses, Luther was largely addressing this practice, and certainly not calling for widespread theological or ecclesiastical reform. So here's the thing, too, that most of us don't know. Luther had already said much more controversial things about a month prior in another document that he had released on Twitter, not really, but that he had shared. Luther critiqued the whole way in which medieval theology had been done for centuries. In that document, it really went through without a murmur, like it wasn't noticed, and it only came to light because of what was stirred up because of the 95 Theses. So here's briefly how it went down. So in response to the nailing of the 95 Theses, the Augustinian order, which was the branch of the Catholic Church of which Luther was a friar, a priest, so the Augustinian order made a significant mistake in that they chose to kind of deal with the situation of the 95 Theses. They treated it like a minor local difficulty. So there was a meeting called in April 1518, so 6 months later, and Luther was asked to present a series of theses, again, like outlining, what do you believe? Like, what do you actually believe here, so that it could be assessed by his colleagues? Is he a heretic? That's kind of what they were asking. And it was there, then, that the relatively bland 95 Theses gave Luther an important opportunity to articulate the theology that he had already been kind of developing. And that was expressed then, had been expressed in the September document, but they met in Heidelberg for this meeting. And so the document became known as the Heidelberg Disputation. Dun, dun, dun. And the Heidelberg Disputation is significant, for it really sparked the Reformation, for in it, amongst other pivotal teachings that formed the future church, most significantly, Luther speaks of what came to be known as the theology of the cross. This, my friends, the theology of the cross, this is also a good phrase for you to know. The theology of the cross is what keeps me grounded in Lutheran theology as the place that's right for me. It's a phrase and a way of seeing that I hope you will feel renewed in, if this is something you've already become familiar with today, that you would be like, yes, that's right. So, or for you to really grab hold of as something new to articulate, because that's what we're going to explore now. So are you still connected with that question about your own time, hard time, suffering? Keep holding on to that. Whew. So near the end of the Heidelberg Disputation, it says, so this is going to be, I'm going to put up on the screen. So there are 28 theses, and so this is 19 and 20 that we're going to look at. Warning, so Luther, his writing style can seem pretty archaic and awkward for us to read now, like with our modern eyes. So kind of focus in with me as we read this. So this is what he says. That person does not deserve to be called a theologian who looks upon the invisible things of God as though they were clearly perceptible in those things which have actually happened. So again, the person does not deserve to be called a theologian who looks upon the invisible things of God as though they were clearly perceptible in those things which have actually happened. So just pause there. This is a really interesting statement. Luther is saying that to be a theologian, or as a Jesus follower is how I would say it, that it isn't right or it isn't enough that we see God at work in the things around us, that we perceive God in unseen ways. Which I find surprising that he would say that, because I'm like, I think seeing God at work in everyday things around us, like that's a thing. So, but Luther is saying, nope, that's not enough. And really he's saying that to hold alongside, here's the key, to hold it alongside the next thing that he's about to say, the rest of this statement, which is number 20, and I've made it gender inclusive, which is why there's the brackets, but it says, that person deserves to be called a theologian, however, who comprehends the visible and manifest things of God seen through suffering and the cross. So again, that person deserves to be called a theologian, however, who comprehends the visible and manifest things of God seen through suffering and the cross. So a theologian, or again, a Jesus follower, is one who sees God in the places of suffering, that God is made known most profoundly on the cross. To hear that, if you're feeling a little mental discord with this, there should be some cognitive dissonance. That should be there. Luther says here that this is the theology of the cross, that where we see God as the God who is made most known and available and visible to us is in Jesus' death. That was the moment of God's most profound revelation of who God is, showing us this is what God's glory is, this is what God's power is, which sounds completely flipped upside down. from what we expect power and glory in God to look like. We've named this in different ways. At Salt House, this has come up because we are Lutherans, so it's just kind of been in there. And you probably have heard this in subtle or in direct ways, even in other non-Lutheran churches, because again, this has fueled the ways in which churches now speak about who Christ is, what the cross is. But this is where it comes from. It comes from Luther's influence, which is very much rooted in the Apostle Paul's writing. So really, it's Paul's language here too. We've heard this, and yet I'll say it again, that this should feel uncomfortable, even wrong, and I want to explore why. So we hear today what Luther would call the theology of glory. The theology of glory is a perception held in contrast to the theology of the cross. We live in a world and a Christian narrative that speaks a message of the Jesus story that contradicts the theology of the cross. Instead, there's this theology of glory. Examples of that include any time that we hear that God is a transactional God. Not that people use that language, but there's this message around, okay, just work hard to be good people, just be a good person, to achieve, to do our work and get our act together, and then God will bless us. Like that pat on the back, good job, gold star, you're on the good list. So we also hear it even more strongly from preachers who claim that once you give your life to Christ, that suffering vanishes. And look out because lots of money and blessing is coming your way, often called the prosperity gospel. In this theology of glory, God's power is known in blessing and riches and the avoidance of pain and suffering. Are you familiar with that? Do you hear that? Those messages that are there? Yeah. Just a final piece too, just the theology of glory is also all the ways in which power means being on top, that it comes through winning, which means someone loses, very often involving violence and hatred and oppression of others. That's power through that lens of theology of glory. Theology of glory continues to be something that we hear. It's something that we even speak at times because it makes sense to us, right? It aligns with our systems of privilege, of power, of earning a reward, right? I've worked hard, so I get something, right? Like that's how the world works, right? And it's not that God is absent from the times of blessing that we experience, because I do believe God can be in those things too. But if we're saying that, then what do we make of suffering? Is God cursing us? Is God absent in the suffering times? Where is God in those times? Enter the theology of the cross. People often talk about how hard it is to comprehend God, to see God, to grasp who God is, what God is. The theology of the cross affirms that, says, man, yeah, it's hard. It's hard to wrap our minds around, to see who God is, but not for the reasons that we suspect. It's not that God is hidden in majesty and power and God is just too glorious for us to sense beyond our comprehension. But the God that we know in Jesus is broken. We follow a broken God, a God made greater and most glorious and revealed to us in death on the cross. And the language that we use in the theology of the cross is to say that God is hidden. Our God is most clearly revealed as hidden. How's that for contradiction? How's your cognitive dissonance now? And we say hidden, we say that because God is right where we'd never expect God to be. Because where would we never expect to see God? Well, born in a manger as a vulnerable newborn, that's kind of one place. Sitting at tables with lepers and tax collectors and the outcasts of society. Turning over tables in the temple, feeding the hungry and touching the sick and healing them, being tortured and publicly executed in a brutal display of violence and power. Yeah, God was there. Where else? We would never expect to see God in our pain, in our suffering, in war, in sex trafficking, in racial profiling, in injustice, anxiety, betrayal. The theology of the cross names that God is our God who is present in suffering, found in suffering, the one who suffers with us. So keep on the forefront now your experience, whether current or past, of suffering. The theology of the cross speaks to our experience, our pain, and God says, "Hi, I'm here with you." There in weakness and despair and vulnerability, betrayal, hard times, God is there. Hidden, right? Hidden there, right where we least expect it, suffering with us, for us. So yes, God is hidden right where we'd never expect God to be, our hidden God. In your own story, in hard times, have you been found by our hidden God who was there suffering with you? Before I started here at Salt House, I led a care ministry program at a large Lutheran church in the Bay Area in California, and I've talked about that experience, but man, I was all up in people's pain all the time. Like, suffering is just where I got to dwell. There was also like births and baptisms and beautiful things too, so it wasn't all hard, but there were beautiful things too. But I have to tell you that in the midst of such heartbreak and pain in people's lives, it is the theology of the cross. Jesus finding us there in the pain and experiencing that again and again. That is the only thing that got me through. That made it possible to not only not be burnt out, but to actually grow in my love and faith in our God who is hidden in suffering. And I wonder, is this your story too? We've talked a lot about suffering actually this month, because this month we've walked the road of compassion together, and I say that, I bring it up now because how did we define compassion? Being with suffering, the connection with the suffering of others. So being with suffering, to suffer with, that is what compassion is. It's not just a warm, fuzzy feeling it's actually being with the suffering of others. And so with intention, we finish this Compassion Month on this 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation by naming that our God suffers with us. So to hold that, this is the theology of the cross, right? God is compassion by definition. Our God is the God of compassion, the one who suffers with us. And God's compassion becomes then the defining source of our compassion, our God who suffers with us. Our God who finds us in the darkness of suffering, our God who pours compassion through us so that we might meet others in their darkness too. And I wonder, has this been your story? Are there now, those glimpses of God's love, God's presence, God's encouragement showing up in the words and actions, the love of others, and the circumstances that got you through, that are getting you through the hard time, those breadcrumbs leading us through the darkness? Is that your story? Those breadcrumbs that always lead us through the darkness of death into resurrection, right? That's it, right? That's what it means for God to be revealed on the cross, because the cross leads to resurrection. That God goes there to death with us, meets us in our deepest vulnerability and in our shame, and with those breadcrumbs that lead us to the light of a new day, which gives us hope, which is another thing that's hidden there at the cross and in suffering. There is hope. Theology of the cross says that we hope because of the darkness. We hope because of suffering and death, knowing that this is the very place where God finds us, the place where resurrection becomes a possibility. And here it is then. Here's why theology of the cross matters. And I want to put it on the screen because it's that important. If all our crucifixions are leading to some possible resurrection and are not dead-end tragedies, this changes everything, right? If God is somehow participating in the suffering of humans in creation instead of just passively tolerating it and observing it, that also changes everything. Do you hear that? My friends, this can change everything for us. We can be changed by this. The theology of the cross claims suffering and pain as the birthplace of God's presence with us, leading us into resurrection. So, holding all of that to kind of close our time, I want to offer a way of living into this a how-to of sorts, but also frame it in the language and lens of our fall series that we're living through, being changed and living through the changes that we face. So first, Scripture offers so many nudges for us, naming how we live into this theology of the cross. For just one example, we're going to just read briefly Romans 4, 4, and 5. Matt was supposed to read. Are you ready for that? Sweet. So come on up just to hear another voice. So this passage was pivotal in forming Luther, particularly his naming the phrase justification by faith, or by grace through justification by grace through faith. This idea that it is God's effort, not ours, that sets things right between us and God. So this passage speaks to that. It also speaks to just how we embrace this theology of the cross. Thanks, Matt.
If you are a hard worker and do a good job, you deserve your pay. We don't call your wages a gift. But if you see that the job is too big for you, that it is something only God can do, and you trust Him to do it, you can never do it yourself, no matter how hard or how long you worked. Well, that trusting in Him is what gets you set right with God, by God. Sure gift.
Awesome. I kind of love that you stumbled over the little hyphen thing, that trusting God to do it, because that is, I feel like, something that we absolutely stumble over. Like that is the thing that here God is hidden in with the gift of grace. Not when we've worked hard and earned it, that wouldn't actually be a gift, right? But the grace and gift and being met by God happens in our surrendering, that trusting God to do it, that we stumble over. Simply in opening ourselves to receive the gift. That's how we do it, in the trusting God to do it. So alongside this, I want to hold and end with a quote from Luther. Again, this is in his writing Defense of All the Articles. It came a few years later in 1521. And just alongside this, please continue to hold your experience of a hard time. So here's Luther one more time. This life, therefore, is not righteousness, but growth in righteousness. Not health, but healing. Not being, but becoming. Not rest, but exercise. I love this sentence. We are not yet what we shall be, but we are growing toward it. The process is not yet finished, but it is going on. This is not the end, but it is the road. All does not yet gleam in glory, but all is being purified. I love this vision of how our lives continue to unfold, and yes, how this articulates the journey that we've been on this fall as people being changed, always being changed, that the road that we walk is this road. This is life. This is the life that we live in Jesus. The reason I'm a Lutheran and a Lutheran pastor at that is because of all of this. And you don't have to be Lutheran to believe this, just to be clear. But I'm grateful for the voicing of the theology of the cross that Luther offered us 500 years ago. I am a Lutheran because I believe that the most important thing I can do is let God do it, is surrender to God and to be found by God, not when I've worked my tail off and done all the things the right way, though I try, but to be found when I am hurting and lost and suffering and overwhelmed by my life and by the pain in the world. There is God, our God who meets us there and puts us on that road of change because we believe that we are being changed. We are not yet what we shall be, but we are growing toward it, becoming. Because it is at the cross, not on the mountaintop, where God finds us and invites us to come and die, to live. The Protestant Reformation was not just a moment, it was a movement. It still is a movement. We are part of a tradition that never stops reforming, that never stops being met in darkness to be drawn into who we are becoming, both as individuals and absolutely as a community of people who belong to God and belong to each other. So my friends, as the band comes back up, as things get set, we're going to sing a great hymn written by Martin Luther, A Mighty Fortress is Our God. Some of that language will get you again. It's good.